Mutual Broadcasting System presents STRAT, Strategic Risk Assessment Talk. With today's briefing, here is retired Marine Intelligence Officer Lieutenant Colonel Hal Kempfer.
Welcome to STRAT. And our Strategic Risk Assessment Talk is going to talk about what basically is dominating the news. And that's that the United States and Iran have agreed to agree, shall we say. There's a Memorandum of Understanding supposed to be signed sometime later this week, maybe Friday, June 19th. And it was announced first by Pakistan, the Prime Minister of Pakistan. And then it started coming out from the White House that that Iran had agreed to this thing. So this MOU, which is not the same thing as a Memorandum of Agreement, it's a Memorandum of Understanding, but that this thing has happened. So we're at the cusp of a rather substantial U.S.-Iran deal. But I want to get into some of the details on it because there's a lot of things that are supposed to be in there, and we'll have to find out if they really are in there. But if the agreement had been signed on June 14th, as had been indicated on June 13th, it might be. And there you talk about electronic signature because none of the parties could get together to actually sign it in person. This would have put it on Donald Trump's 80th birthday, which he is celebrating in traditional White House fashion by having an ultimate fighting contest event in the Round of Rose Garden. Rather unusual, a little different. First time I think that's ever happened. All right. Now, it could be Iran's hesitance to agree to do any signing thing on the 14th is actually, in part, maybe due to the fact that that is Donald Trump's 80th birthday. That's very possible. I haven't heard much on that, but certainly heard a lot about what had happened on his birthday. So I'm kind of wondering if Tehran may have said, we're not going to do this and give him a birthday present. That may be something they actually discussed in-house. I don't know. Now, again, this is a Memorandum of Understanding. It's not an agreement. It's not a Memorandum of Agreement. It's not a treaty. It's not a peace agreement. And I say that because I have heard various politicians using all of those terms to kind of describe what this is. It's a Memorandum of Understanding. It basically says that we have an understanding that this is what we're going to do. And one of the first things it says is the Strait of Hormuz has to be reopened, that Iran has got to stop interfering with shipping, which means they've got to stop firing missiles, anti-ship missiles, drones, using small fast boats, certainly any submarines, which I haven't seen a lot of submarine stuff, but they do have some midget submarines out there. And of course, they're supposed to clear sea mines. Again, that has gone back and forth. Sea mining is a huge potential risk, but I haven't seen any ships that got hit by mines. The one image I had of a mine was a mine floating on the surface, or appeared to be floating on the surface. There was actually an underwater moored mine, and it made me wonder if that wasn't kind of staged for that picture because it actually came from my source tied to Iran. So I don't know how many sea mines or if any sea mines are actually out there, but I do know that Iran has a significant sea mining capability, but that all has to be cleared out. They have to have full movement of ships north, through the strait, north, south, if you want to say that, although the strait kind of bends around, so it's a little bit not quite north, south, but going either way through the Strait of Hormuz. All right. So we'll see if that happens. Then there's supposed to be a 60-day discussion period, negotiation period, where they're going to work out the details on a variety of different things. And during that 60-day pause that the Memorandum of Understanding imposes, the really difficult issues of an agreement are to be worked out. And to get into, so what does each side want? Well, what does the U.S. want? Well, one of the U.S. demands is that Iran cease its quest for nuclear weapons. And look, Iran, every time the press on this says, oh, no, we do not want a nuclear weapon. That's what they say overtly. Covertly, they're always working behind the scenes to find some way to build a nuclear weapon. But overtly, they'll always say that. So having Iran actually say publicly that they're not going to pursue a nuclear weapon really doesn't mean a lot, historically speaking. And whereas we used to say in the Cold War, trust but verify, with the Iranians, it's always verify and verify. I don't trust them to do anything they say. So that actually has very little meaning. But if you want to add it in there, yes, they have said they do not want to pursue a nuclear weapon for whatever that's worth. The real thing is, are they their capabilities to build a nuclear weapon, and then their capabilities to deliver that nuclear weapon. And this touches on their rather large ballistic missile program with thousands of missiles, some of which have some very long ranges. They can reach all the way up into Europe. Some have been estimated to go as far as London and Paris. Not a lot of those missiles, but they may have some. So this tells you that they have some pretty significant ballistic missile capability. And you can only imagine if they were to put a nuclear device or a warhead on this, what sort of mayhem and destruction that could possibly incur. Hence, ballistic missiles have often arose as an area talked about that we, the U.S. and Israel, want them to curtail. And certainly Israel has a very vested interest because they've been hit a lot with Iranian ballistic missiles being fired at their air defense system. Yes, they want to stop that from happening. So part of it's the delivery means. All right. Part of it is stopping that and containing their ability to deliver those missiles. All right. Another thing we've seen is, just to give you an idea of this, we've seen vast volleys of Iranian missiles flying towards Iran. Now, Israel could stop about 90% plus of those missiles coming in. But if they had 10 missiles with nuclear warheads and Iran stopped 9, and just one got through, you can imagine what a nuclear weapon could do to a city like Tel Aviv. And within Israel, it's a very small country. If a city like Tel Aviv was basically wiped out by a nuclear warhead, that really curtails the ability of Israel to operate as certainly a nation state like we know them now, not to mention the horrific loss of life and suffering and everything else. But it could be almost a national existential level event. So Israel has a very strong reason to stop Iran from developing any nuclear weapons, just because you do the math and you realize that just one weapon going through could really damage Israel, its economy, its ability to operate as a cohesive nation state. Not to mention the loss of life and suffering, everything else that would go on. So that's one of the reasons Israel is so hard and fast about this. Has got to be something that we have to work with. And so far, the world's agreed and the U.S. has agreed. So that's something that they're pushing on, they're pushing very strong on. Part of that gets into what does it take to make a nuclear weapon. Now, the know-how to create a nuclear weapon it's fairly well disseminated. It's the material, and in this case, we're looking at enriched uranium, taken over to 90% enrichment, which would make it into the weapons grade capability stuff. They have a very large amount of 60% enriched uranium, which was well above what had been agreed to in the JCPOA under the Obama administration. And going from 60% to 90% isn't that tough. So what we want is to take that 60% enriched uranium and to pull it out of the country, get it out of there. There's been some talk about de-enriching it. I don't know how much de-enriching we can do. I will tell you that if it de-enriched it to, say, 20%, my understanding is going from 20% to 60% isn't that hard. And then going from 60% to 90% isn't that hard. So I'm kind of curious what that de-enriching would actually look like, and if we were to do something like that. So that's something that's been kicked around and talked about out there, but I'm not sure if that's what they're going to do. But some of it is actually referred to by President Trump as nuclear dust, and that's because we hit some of those sites where they hold this stuff with some very large weapons, and these are underground sites. And so so basically the inference is that these are very damaged areas that are probably very contaminated with radioactive material, which means it's going to be really tough. Trying to deal with the nuclear dust and trying to deal with all of this implies a very large operation, a lot of logistics, a lot of specialized capabilities to deal with a contaminated environment like that. And so, and that's where you start hearing where they kind of say, well, maybe we'll go for that de-enriching concept. But the question is, who's going to oversee this? Who's going to inspect these sites? Who's going to make sure it's actually being done? We can't really trust the Iranians to say, hey, we did it ourselves and it's all okay now, because they have a long history of saying things and then doing the exact opposite. All right. Also, Iran has a series of proxies around the region. If you go in Hamas and the Gaza Strip and the West Bank to a lesser extent, Hamas, the war in Gaza and all that, they were backed by Iran. They were backed by the Revolutionary Guard Corps, and it's Al-Quds force of the Revolutionary Guard Corps. So they were backed by him. Hezbollah in Lebanon is backed by him. There are Shiite extremist militias operating in Syria. There are very large, very powerful, very influential Shiite militia groups. The biggest three operate under a thing called the Popular Mobilization Front in Iraq. So they're busy. And then you have the Houthi rebels, depending on how you pronounce it, down in Yemen, who have been causing mayhem with the Red Sea and everything around the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, which is that critical waterway that allows ships to go up through the Suez Canal and back and get into the Indian Ocean. And that's, really upset and upended global supply chains. So they have this very extensive network. Now, if you go back to the origins of Iran's regime, going to 1979, they kind of justified themselves by expanding the Shiite revolution throughout the region. And there's an area from Iran that shoots up through Iraq, Syria, and then over to Lebanon, which is often referred to as a Shiite crescent. These are Shiite Muslims. The friction, the conflict between Shiites and Sunnis in Islam has often been said to be greater than the friction between Muslims and the Jews of Israel, so to speak. Anyway, that Jewish-Muslim thing kind of pales by the wayside when you look at this Muslim versus Muslim thing with Shiites and Sunnis. Saudi Arabia is a center of gravity for the Sunni Muslim faith, and the Shiite Muslim faith center of gravity is in Iran. And hence Saudi Arabia and Iran are constantly going at it as well. So that's been a big issue with those guys. So this has been part of what they do. And if you go back historically, Hezbollah was started up in Lebanon in the early 80s, a Shiite Islamic extremist group very much tied to Iran. They're the ones that are responsible for bombing the U.S. Embassy and the Marine barracks at the Beirut International Airport in 1983. And I know I've said this before, but that's the first time I personally knew someone that had been killed by terrorists. That was at the Marine barracks there. All right, all of that is tied to Iran. All right, that is something that they've done through their proxy network. All the problems we've had with the Houthis in the Red Sea area and around the straits, that's been tied to Iran. So that's part of their network. All right. Now, ostensibly, the Hezbollah is supposed to disarm and demilitarize and become a political force, just a political force within Lebanon. They are a political force within Lebanon. They are the dominant representative of the minority Shiite group within Lebanon. Albeit they're a very large minority, and because of that, they're very influential, and they have members that sit in their parliament, a parliamentary body, and so they have a lot of influence, along with being this, military group with a lot of ballistic missiles and drones that fire stuff into Israel. So that is this big organization, and Israel and the government of Lebanon have been working together to try and find some way to disarm and stop the Hezbollah from firing into Israel and attacking Israeli interests in the region. And so they're supposed to be part of this agreement, right? We're going to see about that. And we'll see if Iran has any ability to curtail what Hezbollah actually does in aiming at Israel. So, but all those things you heard about the Israeli-Lebanese ceasefire, that was all between the government and Israel and did not involve Hezbollah. And Hezbollah came back and says, we don't recognize it because we weren't a party to the agreement. So that's there. Now, Iran is a Shiite regime, as I mentioned. I'm not going to go into all of this, the history of where that all came from, but let's just say there's a lot of friction between the Sunnis and the Shiites. You may recall that Saddam Hussein in Iraq was Sunni, and the majority of Muslims in Iraq are Shiite. So there was a religious part of that, and when he was captured and then executed in the O's, that was part of that was that the government of Iran is predominantly Shiite now. And so that's a change that took place there. Now, in Syria, that was run by the Assad family for decades. They're out. New government's in there. The Assads were from the Alawite clan. The Alawite clan are Shiite, but again, not a majority of everybody in Syria. And now it's ruled by essentially a Sunni-based regime. The head of government is actually a former Al-Qaeda member, which is a Sunni Islamic extremist group. Obviously, they're the ones responsible for all the events on 9/11. So Syria is no longer a part of this network that Iran can rely on in the region. And then we talked about the Houthis in Yemen, and then Hamas in the Gaza Strip. And so anyway, there's a lot going on here that they have to look at. There's also $25 billion that is really on the table right now for being, potentially passed over to the Iranians. But as I understand with the agreement, they're going to make sure the Iranians do a step-by-step thing to ensure compliance with the stipulations of the MOU, not the least of which is get the Strait of Hormuz back open again, but also with these other things. So I don't expect that to be transferred anytime soon. And I think that certainly after President Trump had used that as a campaign issue about the Obama administration passing over all those billions of dollars that went to Iran, which then they, according to him, they used to pay for terrorism and used to pay for their WMD program, weapons of mass destruction, or nuclear program, that he's very reticent to pass much of that money over. One thing that has not occurred going into this is there hasn't been a major regime change, despite the fact that the original players on February 27th really aren't, most of them are gone because they were killed at the outset of the war. But we have not seen anything like the protests of January or December. And that's because 40,000 protesters were killed in January. And I think a lot of people are really nervous about going on the streets because they see the besieged militia and the Revolutionary Guard Corps down there. And certainly the regime has not been shy about saying that they might turn around and do the same thing to them now that they did back in January. So that's kind of held in abeyance. All right. Now, what the Revolutionary Guard Corps wants is they want to keep doing their nuclear program. They want to still control the Strait of Hormuz, and they still want to be able to use their proxy network and support the proxy network. So we're going to have to see if this thing this MOU leads to an agreement where all those things stop. And for the Revolutionary Guard Corps, some of those things I talk about is kind of how they identify themselves. This is how they see their mission in life. This is how they see their existential reality is doing this. So they're having a tough time. It's not surprising that we'll hear the government, or who we think is the government of Iran, saying one thing, and then we'll find some spurious attack from a Revolutionary Guard Corps unit, which kind of upends everything else. That's part of this dynamic within the regime. Although, if they cannot get oil being sold, if they cannot end the blockade, which is something that they want, and we have said, I guess tentatively, that if they agree to all this other stuff, we'll pull back the blockade. If they can start selling oil, and there's been talk about that some of the sanctions on selling oil would be dropped as part of this larger agreement, that then they could possibly save their economy from slipping into what looks like now a complete collapse around late summer. And for the regime, despite their ideological extremity, they realize that at some point, if the economy completely collapses, they will no longer be in power. So despite their, very extreme hyper ideological views, and despite all these things they've done to upset the apple cart on some meaningful negotiation so far, there is this reality they have to deal with, which is a proverbial sword of Damocles, hovering over their heads, which says if you don't come up with something soon, you won't have anything that you can actually protect because everything will fall apart. So this is the MOU. This is a Memorandum of Understanding. We will see what happens this coming week. We're going to see if the Iranians actually perform. The big test, the really huge test, is Iran opening up the Strait of Hormuz. Obviously, the Revolutionary Guard Corps would love to keep the strait controlled. They want to charge a toll for all ships going in and out of there. That's a violation of international law. It's a violation of maritime law. The U.S. has said absolutely not. All countries of the world have said absolutely not. And so that's that's going to be the big test, is they're going to have to see if they can do that. And closing the strait was something they did after we attacked on February 28th. So this is not something we inherited before. This is something that came out of the conflict. But we're going to see if they can actually perform before anything takes place. And I think that'll be the big test if this is going to actually work and actually do something. So I'm not holding my breath of this thing actually going smoothly. I think this ceasefire we've had so far has been very fragile. And at times it kind of really got you looking at the definition of the term ceasefire because there was so much fire going back and forth. But we'll see which way this goes. And it could be a momentous occasion. And if the regime is serious about getting the enriched uranium out of there, getting inspectors all over their country looking for potential nuclear locations, nuclear sites, curtailing their ballistic missile program, and literally cutting off that umbilical cord to all their proxy terrorist groups around the region. If they're really serious about doing that, then maybe we really have achieved something. That'll be something. But the truth will be determined. Hence, the devil is definitely going to be in the details on what comes going forward, and we'll see what happens. Hey, thanks for listening to STRAT, and you can please visit stratpodcast.com. You can also go to my YouTube channel at Hal Kempfer TV, or you can go to the website at www.gripsa.com. You can also, if you're listening to this soon, go to www.infraguardlosangeles.org on Tuesday morning. That's from 9 to 11:30 Pacific time. I'm going to be doing a 2.5-hour global threat update, a world of wars, where I basically take a trip around the world and look at all the different conflicts going on. The Middle East obviously included. That'll be right up front. So please do that. And if you're interested about gray zone or hybrid warfare activities going on around the world, the gray zone webinar is still available through InfraGard in an encore format. So take advantage of those while they're still out there. And hopefully many of you will decide to go to, again, www.infraguardlosangeles.org and have a chance to sit down on the Global Threat Update. And hope you listen again to the next STRAT podcast.